Welcome everybody to the session, Show Me the Money, Other Ways to Fund Shared Mobility. My name is Álvaro Villagran. I am a program manager at the Shared Use Mobility Center. For the benefit of our visually impaired participant, let me describe how I appear on the screen. I'm an Hispanic man with light skin, dark hair and beard, wearing a sky blue shirt. Four panelists in this session will discuss innovative, equitable, and sustainable ways to fund shared mobility. Today, we welcome Dr. Peter Adriaens, who is the CEO of Aquarius Risk Analytics and the director of the University of Michigan's Center on Smart Infrastructure Finance. Dr. Robyn Marquis, leader of the New York Clean Transportation Prices Program at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, also known as NYSERDA. Kathryn Snorrason, managing director for the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and Sojang Kim, current student at the University of Chicago Law School and past Transportation Policy and Finance Fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation. Thank you all for joining us today. To launch this panel conversation, let me ask you, what are the innovative approaches to funding, supporting shared mobility in an equitable and sustainable way?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Like Alvaro said, my name is Kathryn Snorsen, and for those visually impaired, I'm a Polish-Lithuanian woman wearing a black shirt and long brown hair. And like Alvaro said, I am the managing director with the state of Michigan, with the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification. And so wanted to kick things off today, looking forward to the discussion amongst the group and talk about some innovative ways that the state of Michigan has looked at funding mobility testing and deployments here in the state of Michigan. So we started to play around and test with different funding models back in 2018 under our previous program called Planet M. So if anyone's familiar with that, that's what we used to be called in 2018. And so we launched a grant program for 2 years, from 2018 to 2020. And what we were really looking to do was fill a gap in the market to provide funding for mobility and electrification companies from around the world to come to Michigan, just because that's where I'm located, but this model could be rolled out in other places to test and deploy their mobility technology. And the state could play a role in removing some of those barriers for those testing and deployments and engage the community to make sure that not only innovative technologies could be tested in the state, but we could also be addressing resident needs, which is definitely a topic that I'd love to talk about today. And so we introduced that grant program where the first version of it was the state covering about 75% of the costs to test or deploy here in the state of Michigan. And now that we've launched that program for 2 years, from 2018 to 2020, we took a lot of lessons learned and actually just relaunched it. It's called the Michigan Mobility Funding Platform that I can talk a little bit more today, but it was great to get some of those lessons learned about what innovative models work from the public sector side. And so now what we're looking to do is really provide gap funding. So our call to action for mobility and electrification companies is for them to gather, design a testing or deployment for their innovative technology that also answers the need of residents here in Michigan, gather the right partners around the table, public and private, and pull together all of the in-kind and financial funding available from those partners, and then apply to the state of Michigan for the gap funding. So that gap funding could be 10% of the cost or 90% of the cost. It can really be whatever that group is looking for. But we want to come in, take that risk with the public and private partners around the table, and provide that gap funding. So that's just a quick intro on a little bit of the history of our grant program. And we wouldn't be able to launch that without other public sector partners across the state, like MDOT and others. So I hope these are some topics that we get into a little bit more, but I'll pass it off to some of my other panelists here to answer the question as well.
Thanks, Kathryn. I think I'll jump in as another state representative. So some similar feedback from a state perspective. This is Robyn Marquis from NYSERDA. I am a Caucasian female. My long hair is currently pulled back, and I am wearing a black and white polka dot shirt. So as Alvaro said in the introduction, I am currently leading NYSERDA's Clean Transportation Prize program. So that in and of itself is a very innovative approach that we're taking in the state and kind of a first of its kind program that we're running. But I will similarly take a step back and provide a little bit of history of some of our work and how we got to this particular initiative. So I'm on the Clean Transportation team at NYSERDA, and we are one that is integrated between both our R&D and innovation work and market development and incentive programs. Our team, for example, also manages the electric vehicle and electric vehicle charging station rebates for the state. So we do a lot of large scale incentive programs. And in July of last year, our Public Service Commission adopted an EV make-ready order that is to provide funding for the infrastructure necessary to support New York State's ZEV goals for 2025 and beyond. And during the public comment period for the initial white paper, there was a lot of feedback from groups that were hoping to see more on increasing access to shared modes, increasing access in disadvantaged communities, also considering medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. So in a way to shift from some of the smaller funding programs that we have at NYSERDA, which do support individual solutions or individual technologies with some of this cost matching, like Kathryn mentioned, there was a carve out in that PSC order specifically directing NYSERDA to launch 3 parallel prize competitions addressing various aspects of electrification and mobility, where the state needs to see better solutions and a clearer path to delivering those specific benefits, particularly for our underserved communities in the state, keeping consistent with the Climate Act. So with that program, there is an emphasis on opportunities that can scale and be replicated beyond what's being proven out with the prize funding work, and producing roadmaps for replicating that scale. So we are looking for more holistic solutions, both the deployment of the hardware and physical assets, but what are complementary policies, changes in rights of way, innovative partnerships, really thinking about the total package of concentrating resources in a specific neighborhood and updating their transportation system with a heavy emphasis on community engagement and equitable access to these particular modes. So that's just a little bit about the prizes, and I will now pass it off as well.
Hello, everyone. This is Peter Adriaens. For those visually impaired, I'm a bald Caucasian man. I wear a gray jacket and gray shirt. And I'm a director at the Center of Smart Infrastructure Finance, as was originally indicated. The Center Smart Infrastructure Finance, of course, relates and leverages the hot topic, I guess, of smart cities and digital financing, and trying to bring both of these two together. So our center is in civil and environmental engineering, but we have collaborations with the School for Public Policy, as well as the business school at the University of Michigan. Our outside partners, so it's not a research center in the traditional sense, it's a center that works with investors, investment bankers, with policymakers to some extent, technology companies, EPC providers, engineering, procurement, construction providers that are all engaged in the build out of smart infrastructure, including mobility infrastructure, which of course we're talking about today. The emphasis of the center is really on looking at new and innovative financing models on how you build out and the hardware and the software and the infrastructure surrounding mobility infrastructure. One of these applications is, for example, value capture financing. Value capture financing are different kinds of models where we try to recover private revenues and private revenue sources from all different types. This could be anything from development impact fees to special assessments or whatever they might be, but it goes all the way into data-driven financing. When we talk about data-driven financing, we kind of think about selling forward contracts of what we think the use is going to be of a road, of a parking system, of a mobility infrastructure system. And we sell these, or we structure these as securities that are essentially debt instruments that are sold off into the market. There are actually now public-private partnerships that are being designed. They're called ABS, as asset-backed security public-private partnerships, essentially where these long-term service instruments or debt instruments are packaged under an agreement with between a public and a private partner. The third type of financing relates to tokenization. Many of you probably heard about blockchain. Blockchain is sort of making its way in about everything that has to do with data. And the reason we use these blockchains is because they're kind of easy ways, or well, computerized ways to put data, different types of data. This could be user data, cost data, impact data, including social impact data, all into a smart contract so that we can automate payment structures depending on whether certain key performance indicators have been met or not. One of the benefits of tokenization in the financing of infrastructures that essentially reduces the cost of financing from sort of the traditional bank financing and whatnot down to the cost of software. So which really helps many of the communities to bring down the cost of infrastructure to a more bankable type of infrastructure asset. Again, this whole smart infrastructure financing is very early. It's still very incipient. I got to know it first in the context of a long-term sabbatical, a 3-year sabbatical I did in the city of Helsinki. So it was very close, Kathryn, to your heritage, I guess, country heritage. So Helsinki, Estonia, the Swedes and whatnot are very big into integrating, of course, mobility as a service, among the first ones, I guess, mobility as a service implementation across multiple modes of transportation. I'm going to leave it at that, and I want to sort of open the door for potentially a later question, and that is, what are you doing with all that data? Who owns all these data? What's the security and the privacy surrounding all this data? These are, of course, questions not only from an engineering context, but a policy context and a broader societal context that we need to manage. Thank you.
My name is Sojang Kim. I'm currently a law student at the University of Chicago, but in 2018, I had the pleasure of joining the Center for Transportation, a research and policy think tank in DC, doing all sorts of reading and writing about transportation. And one thing that was of interest to us at the time was sort of a wave of cities and states taxing transportation network companies, so TNCs, and sort of thinking through the rationale behind those decisions, different designs in different jurisdictions. So I think rather than having a great answer to Alvaro's first question, that study really highlighted that just simple taxing of something that's moving is probably not the most thoughtful way to build a more holistic and more equitable transportation and mobility system. So that's why I'm excited to continue talking to the rest of our panelists today. Oh, I'm so sorry. For the visually impaired, I am an Asian woman. I have shoulder-length black hair. I'm wearing a navy blouse with white stripes and pink glasses.
So something I'd love to dig into with this group, and something that is always a question on our mind as a provider of grants is, what does success look like after the grant or after public sector funding has expired? I think especially with some of the shared services that we're talking about, blank as a service, where there's some kind of ongoing operational costs beyond the life cycle of the grant. Really would love to hear this group's thoughts on getting past that hurdle and what would be kind of successful financing models after the grant funding is over.
I can take a first stab, and this was for us here in the state of Michigan, a lesson learned from launching the grant program from 2018 to 2020. And in addition to our office launching that program, we've also seen other public sector financing through MDOT. They launched a couple of Michigan mobility challenges across the state that were focused on a very specific topic. Our grant program has been a little bit more broad, so we've seen that. And one piece that we changed with our new grant program was really pushing applicants to think about the business model themselves actually in their application, because a lot of them come to the table with great ideas for what that deployment or that testing might look like. But we want them to also think about the sustainability long-term to provide that service to residents. So you're not just coming in, providing and making, testing your technology, but making sure you know what that looks like at the end of the deployment as well. And so for some of them, they're at the very beginning stages and they have a good idea of who they'd like to own the contract long-term. Like, let's say it's an autonomous shuttle to a hospital, right? Where we're taking people to appointments. You can apply for grant funding from the state to cover that initially, but we want the applicant to think about, and they can also build this out in the contracting phase too for the deployment. What metrics do they need to collect from that type of deployment so it's easy to build the business case for someone else to own it long term, and then introduce that business model. Maybe it's providing a free service at first, and then identifying where your market is and demand and supply, so you can increase price over time as it makes sense, and it is equitable for the residents using that service. So that's something that we're pushing a little bit back on the companies, and we're open to thinking through that with them when they come to the state of Michigan, also in the contracting phase. We can design that out from the beginning instead of thinking about it after the deployment, really putting our heads together at the beginning on what that business model could look like long term. So that's a lesson learned over here. We're currently implementing it, so I'll have to come back next year and talk about what we saw from that change that we made.
So Robyn, let me give some initial reactions here too. I mean, I assume they can use the grant funding to actually develop the business model, I guess, and the future financing model around these infrastructure deployments, right? So you essentially, the way we look at this, and also with some of our partners, that some of that initial, gift money or grant money, I guess, that we're getting for various different projects is used to test out a business model, test out how you're going to be not only funding it, as in what the revenue streams are going to be, but also how you're going to be financing it, as in, the capital that you're going to be needing, or the capital stack that you will be needing to actually, scale it and sustain it, right? So you need to have infrastructure in place to scale and sustain. And so the funding models, or not only the funding models, but the financing models that we look at initially after a grant period typically are sort of very low cost concessionary loans kind of opportunities that are maybe like a 2% interest loan or something like that, 2.5% interest loan, to sort of slowly start building it up until both the revenue models and then the financing models are becoming clearer over time.
Yeah, something that we're looking at for the prizes in particular is making that distinction between self-sustaining and a sustainable business model. And I've been listening into some of the sessions earlier today as well, and the discussion around who pays for a public good. And I think especially as we're seeing more transit agencies providing these multimodal solutions and being the ones that are operating bike shares, other shuttles, more flexible modes. Something that we intentionally didn't want to require is this self-sustaining, that subsidization and some of these financing models that my co-panelists have mentioned can very much be a part of a sustainable business model. And also for the prizes, something that's a little bit different that we're doing from our other grant programs is not requiring a cost match. So we have asked for the proposers to say how they would use the grant money. So depending on the challenge area, it's either $7, $8, or $10 million is the grand prize award per. So if your idea is, say, an $8 million idea and you're applying in the $7 million, well, we'll give you this first 7, and then where does that other million come from? Is it secured already? What are the plans to secure it? So I think we'll naturally see our initial funding being leveraged but not right out of the gate saying, if you want to apply, then you have to come to the table with 25% or in some cases higher, which is quite cost prohibitive right now, especially for local municipalities or smaller companies that maybe are coming to New York or the US for the first time. That's a lot of money for potentially an implementation risk. So we are kind of to the first question of how we're being innovative. That's one of the aspects that we're trying something a little bit new with this program in particular. But I think this distinction between self-sustaining and sustainable business model is something that I've been very pleased to hear has been part of other conversations today as well.
So back to, I mean, both for Kathryn probably and for Robyn, I mean, kind of a question is, I mean, to what extent do you, or how do you see the engagement, I guess, between the public and the private sector? I mean, if we think about mobility as being a public service, but yet needing sort of a sustainable revenue generating business model so you can actually pay your cost of financing and build out, there needs to be, you know, some sort of an agreement. So are you looking at new kinds of public-private partnerships as well on both ends, or what's the sort of what's the approach that you're taking there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big focus for our office and for the state. Having both those players has been so essential in some of the deployments and projects that we've launched, because we've seen companies from the private sector come together, right? They're really focused on their business model and their technology and the innovation, but bringing the public sector to the side, whether it's the state or community leaders or city leaders. I see we have a few from Michigan on the line today from Grand Rapids and previously from Detroit. That's so essential to hear the voice of the resident in launching these types of deployments and learning how to continue to engage the community as you're deploying that innovation and building it out, because you might come in with an initial idea around what that testing and deployment looks like, but hopefully you're learning as you're going and changing it, and that involves a lot of community engagement. And so it, you know, for us, we've just seen it to be so important to have both public and private players around the table from the very beginning in designing the project. So we not only have our grant program, but we've also launched projects in the past. Like we have one called Project Kinetic in the city of Detroit, where 10 public, private, and philanthropic partners came together. And I think some of my colleagues have talked about that before at this conference. But these 10 Michigan partners came together to understand the transportation needs of Detroit residents. This one was specifically focused on the Detroit community. I think it was about 100 hours of listening to what those transportation needs are. I think 120 ideas were proposed to address those challenges, and then ultimately 6 deployments were deployed in the city of Detroit. And each of those deployments were supported by a private organization, you know, such as Bedrock and others. So there was a private sector lead on each of those deployments, owning it from beginning to end. But that wouldn't have been able to happen without the city of Detroit, the state, MDOT, and others, and philanthropic partners coming in to build out what this project looked like and designing the goals together. So that's also something, Alvaro, I can share. We have a white paper on Project Kinetic as well. And it's essential from the very beginning of designing it to seeing it all the way through to see that, make sure you are seeing results for all the partners around the table.
Yeah, and I can just add for us at NYSERDA and with the prizes in particular, we tend to be very solution and team agnostic, but rather to say, here are the outcomes that we're seeking, the problems that need to be solved, what we're hearing from our market actors. So since we had some guidance for developing the prize program coming out of the PSC order, we were able to kind of specify for each of the 3, you know, here's kind of the future state that we're looking for in terms of electrification and mobility, but not to dictate your team needs to be an A and a B and a C, so a public, a private, a CBO, whatever composition, but to really let the work that they're proposing to do kind of dictate the team that they need to bring to the table. So we do have in our proposal form and the rubric that we have as well, kind of getting at, do they have the right team? Are they credible? Do they have this kind of experience? Do they have the capacity to manage a grant of this size? But not to tell them or presuppose your team, only a team that looks like this is going to be successful in this program, because it will be so situationally or kind of deployment case by case specific, depending on the needs that have been identified by a community. And we do have a heavy emphasis on community engagement as well. So not to have a company or solution provider kind of come in and say, this is, as is, this solution is going to work for you, without at all consulting anyone on the ground or considering local conditions or context. But on the flip side of that, a community has, quite a breadth of needs, but for this specific program, kind of matching up the outcomes that we need to see, and in the communities that we're looking to achieve them, kind of having those specific needs be addressed by the solutions, and meeting somewhere in the middle with team compositions that likely will be all of these partners that we're discussing, without us kind of telling them, you have to bring all of them to the table. But I also want to throw this to Sojang from a TNC perspective. I think this is one that's been particularly a hot topic in terms of public and private, and that meeting in the middle. So would love to get your thoughts on what you've seen and how this has been working. I think especially more recently with some of the newer regulations that are coming out at state levels.
Yeah, so I haven't been able to update this report or really stay too up to date with these new regulations, but I guess an early finding back in 2018 was some of the tax revenue was being kind of allocated out to local schools in a specific city, or kind of retrofitting existing taxi fleets to have better kind of ADA compliance and accessibility. So those are like examples of what you could maybe consider a charge on private funds going to public purposes, but those felt a little attenuated and probably not the most sustainable. So back then, like, we were a little critical of that point. And I would assume, I haven't been able to check that closely recently, but I would assume that there's been a lot more thought into the companies themselves coming in and making more proposals about how they would like to contribute. Like, for example, I believe a lot of TNCs were very behind congestion pricing, really making a breakthrough in New York City. And that's just another example of how these conversations are not just about financing, but also policy, which is like the big, truly just landscape that all of this operates from. So that might be a decent segue into a question about just what role do you all see policy playing in funding mobility solutions? Is it kind of just setting a scene? Is it limiting, or are there ways that that's actually really opened up more innovation?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I just had a few meetings with about 7 downtown authority agencies or groups, because the question has been, for example, in my case, the digital funding and digital financing of these mobility infrastructures. Where do you go, right? Are there any zoning regulations, for example, that would prohibit you from capturing some of the money from private entities? Or how do you set it up? How can the money be put back into an infrastructure project in terms of who it serves? And so I'm learning more and more, but actually I didn't really know much about downtown authorities at all, neither how they were regulated, nor how they were organized, or what they were and were not able to do, say, relative to cities. And I'm finding out that they're fairly forward, quite forward-looking groups of people and organizations that actually have a lot more leeway than cities have that are funded by taxes to actually sort of come up with some of these innovations to think about new kind of financing mechanisms, and kind of see them as a beachhead to spearhead some of these new financing mechanisms.
I would say it's been an interesting balance between programming and policy within our office here in the state of Michigan, because previously we focused on programming, but worked with our legislators And now policy is officially a part of our strategy as a state for mobility and electrification, and seeing these types of deployments launched across the state. So we do have under our office, a council on future mobility and electrification, and doubling down on public and private sector participation. Our council is made up of both of those groups, private and public sector. So from the private sector, we have GM, Ford, Stellantis, Toyota, Waymo, and Rivian. And then from the public sector, we have different departments of, whether it's labor or environment, Great Lakes, and energy. And I just bring up this council because one of their objectives is to come up with policy recommendations for the state of Michigan that goes, it'll be in an annual report that's coming out this fall, but also shopped around to the different legislators across the state to try to get additional funding for these types of innovations, focus on 4 main areas, at least for us, being electrification, infrastructure, insurance, regulatory systems and public safety, and then economic development and workforce development. So this is kind of our first go at having policy officially under our umbrella and having each side of the office inform the other. So learning from what we're doing on the programming side around the grant program, what the community needs are, and working through those P3s, but then seeing the policy side actually coming out with policy recommendations in a formal report that'll be published at some point in September, so coming up soon, that'll go in front of legislators asking for additional funding around very specific topics, including those 4 buckets I mentioned. So another thing to look for, and would love for this group to read a little bit more about it once that first report comes out in September. But it is so important, just hitting on kind of the foundation of the question, that the policy does play a role. But for us, we see it in partnership with the programming side.
Yeah, I'd say in New York, we have kind of similar approaches. And one thing that's a little bit tricky in New York, as well as many other states, is a home rule state. So while a lot of these decisions are discussed kind of at federal or state levels, ultimately the implementations or the decision of how to do a rollout is at the local municipal level. So there's this, not wanting to step on anybody's toes while also kind of helping to maybe make or present some of these recommendations like Kathryn mentioned, or to something that NYSERDA has done is to support some policy research or feasibility studies to kind of prove out things that local municipalities may want to consider in tandem with the actual programmatic considerations or deployment of new solutions. So being a state is often an interesting sandwich between some of the things that jurisdictionally come from the federal government or a local municipality would need to dictate with their local regulations. So we do the best we can to kind of just present here are the suite of recommendations. Here's maybe some places where it's been successful or the data behind those implementations, and especially us being an energy authority, what are some ways in which these deployments can be made in an energy or environmentally conscious way. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, and we did see that there's a question that came in from the audience. So I'm just gonna ask that for the team. What are the best ways to bridge the gap between academic research highlighting benefits of shared mobility and private investors, or to win federal grants from DOTs? In other words, how can those of us publishing academic papers actively contribute to the higher probability of shared mobility projects getting funded?
That is a great question, and also a little bit of a loaded question. So, because of course the objectives in regard to fundamental research grants versus sort of policy and product implementation are very different, right? So we have in our center explicitly said that we were going to be focusing on the development of solutions. So we're going to be working with public finance officials, private financiers, bankers, as well as those that have either infrastructure or enabling technology available, I guess, for integration. And so the academic research, I mean, can be done, I mean, at a more applied level, I guess, where you essentially take, I mean, both theories as well as data models and everything else that have been developed sort of separately under the context of, for example, NSF or whatnot, that actually get applied in the context of an actual application. MCity, of course, here at the University of Michigan, where we have a deployment of all sorts of technologies, I mean, autonomous vehicles and electrification, and then even further now, data models on vehicle to infrastructure integration and whatnot. I mean, are a great exemplar of that, right? Where we're bringing in the whole ecosystem that is becoming part of this sort of next generation mobility. Anyone from the insurance companies, the telcos, the investors, the technology providers and whatnot, you bring them all around the table and you say, okay, well, how do we actually come up with a workable solution? So academics are getting quite involved, I mean, in a number of different applications and try to bridge sort of the fundamental research into a real world application. And then even beyond that, we start working not just with private partners, but also with a lot of public partners, including Michigan Economic Development Corporation and others, to see, okay, well, what would be a great beachhead, I guess, to start to try to deploy this. I mean, so what in which, city, county, or whatnot, are the conditions right to actually try some of these things out, and how do we bring it all the way up to the state? I've talked to a number of staffers of lawmakers and whatnot, and there's a lot of education that needs to happen too in bridge. And speaking of bridging, in bridging the process towards, these new kind of technology integrations, there's sort of a big learning curve, right? As we saw early on with the autonomous vehicles, putting them on the road, how is insurance going to be dealing with that? Are the regulators going to be allowing that? So there's sort of that whole ecosystem that needs significant education. I think, again, that universities, university research grants can play a significant role in that. In fact, we're applying right now for a grant from the Economic Development Agency, which on educating public finance managers on new financing models. And so I think it's bona fide research, but it also has a translational capacity to the public and private sector.
Yeah, and for some of our grant programs, they're pretty varied across the state. We actually required for some of them to have a university partner. So that way they can engage students and different departments at a university in some aspect of the deployment. Typically it's writing kind of a final report on what that could look like long-term. Just depends on what the deployment and that project required for university involvement. And we've even seen now, we have a project we're working on with 3 private sector partners, and they went out and found, and on their own engaged a university. So we're seeing that it's also unprompted as well. And then another way we're partnering with universities and researchers is actually around test sites. So some of our universities here in the state of Michigan have their own test sites, like at the University of Michigan, they have MCity. At MTU in the Upper Peninsula, they have a number of different testing capabilities. And so it's been great to see kind of the research progress through the different stages, as if that's the path for it, to start from research to actually partnering with the testing facility and potentially a company to test what that looks like. And then if it makes sense, going into a real world environment and deploying it with Michigan residents. So that's kind of one path that it could follow. And then working closely with our test sites, we've seen like the American Center for Mobility and others applying for those national grants. And so if universities and researchers and companies are already engaged with those test sites, that just makes for a natural partnership for those partners to come together and apply for a grant.
So from a regulatory perspective, just maybe as a closing question, or we're pretty close to the end here, and back to Sojang, the data side, right? I mean, as we're moving to next generation mobility, there's always the concerns around data privacy, data monetization, a lot of legalities around that. I mean, as basically as a private company, a custodian of data, kind of like in the context of Uber, or are they actually the owner of the data? Who remains to be the owner of the data? How do even the OEMs with their new MOBI program, where the car becomes itself a node on the blockchain? So basically now, are you as a car owner or car lessee the actual owner of the data that is being generated in that car? So how do we navigate some of that legally? Any initial kind of reactions to Jung?
Not from my limited legal training so far, but I do remember when I was at one of the discussions that was going on is sort of scooters had really slammed onto the scene about a year and a half prior, and a couple very enterprising cities in return for the permits to just have those vehicles, well, those like shared items out, was just give us all your data and then we're going to figure out what to do with it later. I believe that was somewhere on the West Coast. So I would think it'd be smart to check in with those sort of agencies who were early adopters of give us your data, probably anonymized, and see what we can do with it. But yeah, obviously that's a huge question, not just in shared mobility, but in like private vehicles, like you were saying, with private automobiles. But it seems like you also have some insights on sort of security and privacy that you wanted to share.
I'll let others chime in for the last 3 minutes. Kathryn, does that come up at all in your at your agency? Or?
Yeah, data is an interesting question for a public agency that's subject to FOIA. So we have to be very careful about our involvement and just be very upfront with companies about that. So that is included in the terms and conditions section of our grant program, that please only share information with the state that could go public. And so that allows us to have a private sector, a third party, create the contracts with our grant recipients and allow for that more secure relationship on that end. And we've seen a lot of applications come in that are focused on data and the sharing of data. One of our biggest success stories was a company called Dirk, who partnered with MDOT to install their technology at a very busy intersection in downtown Detroit to focus on pedestrian safety, to actually alert a fleet of drivers if there are any hazardous conditions as they're driving through, and also track anonymously the pedestrian traffic at that intersection and provide that data back to MDOT so that MDOT could have that data and make decisions as needed, whether it's about the fleet or what that intersection looks like, or any of the infrastructure around that area. So we've seen grant applications come in that are, while there's an infrastructure piece and a deployment piece, there's also a big focus on data and how that can be shared back to the state to make decisions.
Robyn, I'm sure some of your applicants must be very heavily data driven as well.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think I have a similar response to Kathryn's, again, being a public agency, and it is something that we are expecting to see with these more holistic integrated solutions for the prizes, both hardware, software, policy, other solutions as well. So we have asked applicants to provide some details about their data management and privacy practices, and to kind of ensure that they are taking into consideration, in particular, any personally identifiable information. And we have provided, like, here's the state terms, here are some best practices to reference, kind of make sure that that's something that we called out right in the application form. And I know we're almost at close, so I'm just going to take a second to note that for the prizes, if you want to propose, you have to register first, and our registration deadline is next Thursday, July 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Adriaens, Dr. Marquis, Kathryn, and Jung, for a dynamic conversation today on innovative funding for shared mobility. Thanks for the audience that joined this session.